Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. I'm really excited to share my thoughts on a wonderful, wonderful book I just finished reading this morning called Second Nature, A Gardener's Education by Michael Pollan. So this is a book that a member of my church, a friend, had been reading, or I think I just finished reading, and she knew that I loved gardening and was eager to loan it to me, and so I took it with me on vacation last month and got through about half of it, and then have been finishing it up since getting back home. And it was a delightful read for a whole host of reasons. So I'm excited to share some thoughts with you on this book. Michael Pollan has written quite a number of books at this point. This is actually one of his older books. It was written in 1991, so it's more than 30 years old now. It's almost as old as I am, and yet it's very prescient and speaks into a lot of contemporary questions and issues that we'll talk about here in a minute. But just for those of you who may not be familiar with Poland's work, Pollan, I think is actually how he says his name, so I'll try to remember that. Pollan. Michael Pollan writes kind of books of popular science books. He's on a range of topics, a lot having to do with food and gardening and things of that nature. But he's interested in the relationships between humans and our environment, humans and what we put in our bodies. He's done work on a lot of work on food. One of his most famous books is The Omnivore's Dilemma. I also did a review a couple years ago on his book, The Botany of Desire, which is taking 4 different plants and then exploring the relationship between humanity and plants. He's done some more recent work on psychedelics and stuff, which I've not read. But you can see the sort of theme emerging. He's interested in the way that humanity interacts with its environment and the way that the environment shapes humanity and the complex intertwining of these things. And he's picking up on some of those same themes and issues in this book, but he's casting it with a focus on gardening and with in a quasi-autobiographical way. So what Pollan is doing in this book, as you can see in the subtitle, A Gardener's Education, is starting by just walking through his own experience with gardening. And he talks about growing up in New York City, on Long Island, and the way his father didn't care for their yard, their garden at all, just kind of left it to be. And then his grandfather, who had a beautiful garden, very productive, but very regimented and tightly controlled in all of this. And he talks about how he got into gardening himself and his own efforts to sort of navigate between those two extremes, one of just sort of neglect and the other of like hyper control. And he uses his own background and story to deal with some bigger themes. So there's a sense in which, especially the first part of this book, is him telling about how he got into gardening and what he learned along the way. But he's using that to really flesh out historically and culturally how humans and how Americans and Western people in particular have related to nature and the different kind of paradigms and frameworks that we've brought to those questions. And this is where Pollan is putting his finger on something that, if you read books on horticulture or ecology, which is one of a subject of interest for me, you'll find that this is something that is hotly debated right now. So when I first got into gardening a couple years ago, one of the things I quickly learned was that there's a lot of work, research, writing that has been done on sort of the ethics of what we should be planting and the debate between native planting versus non-native plants and invasive plants and all these types of things. And so some people tend to approach gardening with a very anthropocentric view, and so they're thinking about how do we plant a garden that looks beautiful to us or grows the flowers or fruits that we want to grow, whether those things fit in our environment or not, whether they can be grown without the help of fertilizers and chemicals and all these additives or not. And others very much take a kind of ecological view, which says really the plants that we plant should be trying to simply replicate what would have been there before our house was built, whatever was native or natural to that environment. And people can become very judgmental and very harsh about whether you're planting natives or not planting natives, or all these types of things. And there's all sorts of interesting questions that emerge there. But as I sort of observed that space, there does seem to be this sort of divide that emerges between seeing our relationship to the natural environment in general, and maybe even the way that we create and cultivate gardens, as being either something that is about man exerting his control over nature without regard for what might happen there naturally, or an attempt that says really our job should be to restore nature or leave it to itself. And Pollan puts his finger on that whole debate 30 plus years ago and tries to argue for a sort of third approach, right? So you can see in the title of the book, and he kind of develops this in one of his essays. There's a sense in which this book is building a coherent argument, but there's another sense in which it's sort of a collection of essays where he's just looking at some of these tensions of, should we relate to the natural world around us through, exerting our control and ordering nature to suit us, or by leaving nature to its own devices. Those are sort of the alternatives that he sees played out there. And what he's arguing in this book is that both of those approaches, there's an argument you can make for both those approaches, and yet both of those approaches are also vulnerable to critique. And what he argues is that the perspective of the gardener, the education of a gardener, can provide a sort of in between that allows you to draw on and be sensitive to the strengths and weaknesses of both of those instincts or approach. And so what you end up with in a garden, to get to his title, is not nature strictly as such, but a sort of second nature, something that has been cultivated and created by humans, and yet in a way that can also benefit and integrate with the natural world, the natural environment. So that's sort of, in a sense, his thesis, that we need to move beyond just the instinct to either intervene and control completely or step back and leave things to their own devices. And he explores, I think, some of the vulnerabilities of those two instincts. So a lot has been done in the last 30 years on the vulnerabilities of the high control anthropocentric instinct. And I think if you've read works of ecology and conservation, you'll be familiar with those things. There's a lot of ways in which the way that we have approached planting, agriculture, horticulture in the last 50 to 100 years has taken us down a wrong path. Just read Wendell Berry, right, to get this. We have exploited and depleted the land, the natural landscape. We've run roughshod over the dictates of climate and ecosystems and so forth, and we're seeing the catastrophic effects of that in all sorts of areas. You look at the climate, you look at the soil, you look at the nutritional value of our foods and the vulnerability of our food supply as we concentrate growing on just a few hyper hybridized types of foods and plants and so forth. And so there's all sorts of critiques that can be made. Our over reliance on chemicals and fertilizers and what that does to our groundwater and all these types of things. So Pollan talks about some of those things, puts his finger on some of those things. But he also, and I think this was helpful for me because I kind of am a new gardener myself. We got into this in the last 5 or 6 years, really. I've been reading in some of these spaces, and I kind of find myself, that guy seems to have some good arguments. That guy seems to have some good arguments. How do I sort this out? Pollan helped me to sort some of this out by helping me to see that while there are vulnerabilities and problems with the high control, totally anthropocentric view of sort of modern agriculture, modern horticulture, there's also some kind of hidden weaknesses and vulnerabilities to the back to nature movement. Partially just the flaw in the premise that there is a pristine nature that we can go back to, and the idea that us simply removing our hands from nature, stepping out of it altogether and not managing things actually brings you back to a natural state. Part of what he argues is that nature itself has been in flux, right? From a Christian standpoint, I would say nature is fallen. So it's not that nature would just achieve this perfect harmony, and that humans are these sort of invaders who have messed all of this up, but rather that the creation itself manifests examples of the fall. So this is my theology layered on top of what Pollan is saying. He's not an evangelical Christian, um, but and I think another thing that Pollan puts his finger on that is helpful and again resonant with the biblical worldview is that mankind does in a sense stand above nature, but we're not outside of nature, right? We are part of nature. And so for us to critique our own involvement in nature as if it's some intrusion into a foreign order misses the fact that we're part of this world. And we look at how I've got a book on beavers sitting over here that I'm hoping to get to by Ben Goldfarb. And I know enough about the book to know that he's talking about the ways in which beavers can totally reshape the environment, reshape the natural world around them. You look at different keystone species, whether it's bison or something like that, elephants on the African savanna. They create the environment in which they live. If you remove them from the environment, the whole thing changes. The same is true for humans as well. So we have a unique power, both because of our intelligence and our physical capabilities, and I would say because we're made in the image of God and given a call to stewardship. And so we can exert and project our power and preferences more in a more widespread and consistent way than other creatures can. But there's no real grounds to sort of act as if that's always and only bad, right? It's a great power, right? Spider-Man, great power comes great responsibility. But the answer is not just to remove humanity from the equation, which you can get in extreme forms of ecological or environmental concerns, right? That view humans as only parasites who should really be obliterated from, creation altogether. That's the extreme, almost caricature, but there's people who kind of advocate for this, or severe forms of population control and things. Or it's more moderate and I think popular presentation, which says, well, we should carve out areas of the natural world that we just leave untouched and we don't manage and we don't intervene in any way. But what that kind of ends up with, and this is what he talks about in the book, though when you frame things as that, like either we intervene or we don't intervene, either we exert control or we abdicate all control and involvement, what you end up with is what we have in our modern world today, where, like in my neighborhood, we literally bulldoze nature to create space for ourselves. And then if I drive 30 minutes south of here, I'll hit the Shenandoah National Park, and there, we leave things more untouched. Now, obviously, there's still human intervention there in various ways, but that's kind of how we conceive of things. And Pollan is arguing that gardening allows us to create spaces that don't just kind of ping pong back and forth between these extremes. They allow us to create spaces that are only exist because of humanity. You don't have a garden without a gardener, and yet they're spaces that at their best can and should be created and cultivated with an eye to the rest of the natural world, with an eye to life beyond just our own life. And so what he's doing in this book is trying to explore the tension between these different ways of looking at creation and humanity's interaction with creation, and trying to argue that gardening as a discipline, gardening as a disposition, is something that can actually help us to navigate some of these questions and navigate some of these things without falling into either extreme. And so along the way, he ends up talking about a lot of different things. One of the things that's really fun about reading Michael Pollan, if you haven't known that before, is that he has a very rich and fertile mind. He has read widely on all sorts of things. And so in a single sentence, you'll have, allusions to French philosophers, and then explorations of Tudor history, and then he'll be talking about the American founders, and then he'll be talking about upstate New York and California, whatever it is. It's just like, it's very cosmopolitan in the best sense of that term, and he has a capacious mind and understanding, and pulls together information from all sorts of places to give you a fresh way of looking at things. And he's very sensitive to this as well. Almost to a fault, I would say, but very sensitive to the ways in which our understanding, our categories of things layer on top of what is there, but we can sometimes collapse those things. We can sometimes confuse our categories to explain or view things with the things themselves. Now, he almost takes that in a kind of relativistic direction at times that I would object to as a Christian. I do believe there is a reality to things, and a true way of framing things that actually corresponds to that reality. I think we can talk about reality But it's also good to be sensitive to the fact that when we use terms like wilderness or nature or garden, these are things that we have a certain understanding of that's often not articulated or explored or questioned. And so Pollan is really a fruitful conversation partner to help you understand how people have thought about and talked about those things and how that's evolved and developed over time and changed with culture, and to then say, hey, how am I viewing these things, and does it actually correspond to reality, or is it merely a category that I'm using to shape reality kind of to my own values or assumptions or whatever. So really, really interesting book. Just a few more words about how he kind of frames things. So he kind of walked through, like I said, it's sort of autobiographical. It's also sort of thematic, but it does have this bigger question of, how you deal with these different approaches to nature and how gardening can help us sort of push through that roadblock. And so the way he structures that is he has an introduction and a first chapter, which the first chapter is called Two Gardens, where he walks through the way his father dealt with their yard, which was to do nothing to it, just to leave it alone. He didn't even mow the lawn. And then not because he was an ecologist, just because he was lazy and didn't want to care for his lawn. That's kind of how he frames it. And then his grandfather's garden, which was hyper controlled, and all of that. And then he goes through spring, summer, fall, and winter, and has a series of chapters where, again, he traces his own experience as a gardener, and then he just sort of thematically deals with some of the different things related to gardening. 12 chapters, it's about 260 pages, but really fruitful book. I would love to see an updated version of this book that maybe either has revisions or like a postscript, just sort of saying, hey, what would he change about his argument over the last 35 years, given the way that things have unfolded. But one of the things that struck me was that while parts of this were very dated, a lot of it felt very fresh. And so I think if you are a gardener, you're interested in ecology, conservation, the relationship of humanity to creation, which is something that I would say as a pastor, every Christian needs to care about because God has given us a commission to serve as stewards. How should we do that? I actually think Michael Pollan gives us a good presentation of, I think, a pretty biblical way of how we should view our relationship to and responsibility to creation. He doesn't get everything right. He's not framing things theologically. There's more you could add to it, but I think there's a good structure here that we can kind of build on, or things that we could take into a biblical worldview that would go beyond the kind of only exploitative, economically geared view of things, which you find in a lot of American evangelicalism today, or a kind of religiously charged ecological view that you find in more radical environmentalism. I think the biblical view does what Pollan is trying to do, which is to steer a course between these things. So, really interesting book, highly recommend. Second Nature: A Gardener's Education by Michael Pollan.